Welcome to the Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Vantage Fit, the all-in-one AI-powered corporate wellness platform developed by Vantage Circle.
Workplace violence refers to any act of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other aggressive behavior that occurs in the workplace. It can involve employees, customers, clients, or visitors, and range from verbal abuse to physical assaults. Workplace violence can have serious consequences for employees and the organizations as a whole. So let's talk more about this on today's episode of Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast. I'm your host Dipshi, and today I have with me a social entrepreneur and the CEO at Roar, Yasmine Mustafa. Welcome to the show, Yasmine.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
We are so glad to have you here today, Yasmine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So before going to the topic of today, that is workplace violence, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us about your wellness journey?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Yasmine Mustafa. I am the CEO and co-founder of a technology company called Roar. We help protect at-risk workers with panic buying technology. My background, I'm from Palestine. I moved to the US when I was 8 as a refugee. I learned I was undocumented when I was 15. And I started a lot of under-the-table jobs to survive, worked in a lot of unsafe working conditions. When I finally found the pathway to citizenship, I started Roar because I understand what it's like to be unsafe in the workplace, and I don't want anyone else to have those same experiences. So really born out of my own personal experiences that I've had.
Thank you so much for sharing your amazing journey with us, Yasmine. So let's start with today's session.
Sure.
What is the definition of workplace violence, and what are some common forms of violence that can occur in a work environment?
Sure. Yeah, good question. So we specifically work with workers in hospitality, in healthcare, and public spaces. There's different forms, but at the common core, it's really any type of threat or physical violence against a worker in a work setting. Mm-hmm. So it could be something like someone verbally abusing a worker. It could actually be someone assaulting that person, yelling. Beyond yelling, it's punching them, kicking them, even spitting on them is considered a form of workplace violence.
And what are the potential consequences of workplace violence for employees, employers, and the overall work environment?
The consequences can be severe. I mean, for employees, just imagine your job. You put yourself at risk every day you go to work. For hotel workers, specifically housekeepers, they are required to clean around 12 to 15 rooms a day. And every day they open the door, they just never know what's going to be on the other side. And for those that don't know, 58% of housekeepers experience sexual harassment from guests. So guests will open the door naked, they will ask for sexual favors, they will assault the housekeepers, and much worse that I probably can't speak about on this podcast, unfortunately. And it's very common, and it's underreported. Within healthcare, they are assaulted, nurses and doctors are assaulted more than prison guards and police officers. 75% of workers have experienced some type of workplace violence, either from a patient or a family member of a patient, sometimes even from a coworker, which is pretty unbelievable. But yeah, for employers, it could lead to reduced productivity, calling off, burnout, leaving the job in the first place. Right now, there's a labor shortage within nursing that's actually detrimental. Because it's predicted that next year we're just not going to have enough people working to help take care of us. For employers, it could mean increased costs, because now as nurses are leaving, they have to bring in nurses from staffing agencies that are going to cost more. They're going to have to pay overtime for existing nurses. Their turnover rate is going to be high. There might be damage to their reputation, especially if press gets hold of the story, and they might be sued by an employee that had something happen to them. I recently was talking to a healthcare worker. Her first day on the job, she was punched so hard by a patient, she needed facial reconstruction surgery. It's really just crazy that, especially in healthcare, workplace violence is assumed to be part of the job, and really no one should be feel that way or put in that position. And then the impact on the overall work environment is just reduced morale. When your coworker gets punched or kicked or needs facial reconstruction surgery because something happened, you're not going to be happy that day. Your morale is not going to be very high. You might feel afraid. You might have some secondhand trauma, and more importantly, there might be a loss of trust with that employer as well. So a lot of consequences across the board.
Since it is that common among workplaces, so is there a way to prevent workplace violence? Are there any strategies and legal measures that organizations can implement to prevent workplace violence and create a safe working environment?
There are a lot. That's the great news. First and foremost, what we see facilities do is conduct a risk assessment. So they bring someone else to actually evaluate the physical environment, talk to employees, and create a checklist and an assessment, a report of what are the areas that maybe obscure line of sight. Where could it be that someone might be more likely to be attacked because they're isolated or the layout is spread out? What have employees experienced in the past? Is there poor lighting? Things like that. So first and foremost, that is the best way to get started to really be able to evaluate what's at risk in the workplace. And then from that comes specific training. Could there be training in terms of how to be able to tell when someone might be more threatening, to help the staff members actually de-escalate incidents, maybe de-escalation training, conflict resolution training. And then are there specific frameworks or tools or technology that could help staff feel safer, like CCTV cameras or metal detectors or panic buttons and so forth? There are legal requirements. What's interesting is they vary state by state, at least here in the US. There isn't anything that's necessarily on a unified federal level, although it seems like there is more happening in that area. There was just a law passed to increase fines against anyone that attacks a healthcare worker and actually punish them by making it a felony instead of a misdemeanor. Unfortunately, that's more after something's happened. It's not necessarily something to prevent it from happening. But OSHA does, even though they don't have requirements, they do strongly recommend certain procedures to make or safer workplaces, including recognizing panic buttons could help, which I think is great. But there should be a lot more reinforcement and regulation, I believe. And then the Joint Commission has done a really great job of making it a top priority in terms of citing hospitals or healthcare systems if they don't have adequate measures in place, especially when there's repeated instances of violence.
Yes, organizations should actually take this matter seriously and should implement those legal frameworks, which as much as they can, to prevent the violence at work.
Absolutely.
So can you tell me some of the warning signs or red flags that could indicate a potential for violence in the workplace? How would a person know if there is some potential of violence at work?
Well, I think this question I took two ways. I took as an employee, like if I am interested in working at a place, how could I know that maybe, what their history of workplace violence is and how they've addressed it? And then as a worker myself in that environment, what are the red flags I might notice maybe from patients or families of patients? On the latter side, I definitely recommend that anyone that's considering employment anywhere actually asks about the record of that facility. What have they implemented in place? What is the incidence rate? What do they do after an incident happens? How do they support the worker as they come back to work? I think that's a really good sign of the institution's mindset on safety and what priority level they give it. And then for the employee, what they could do to determine if there's a red flag with a patient
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there'll be a record, they'll actually show prior history of violence on that patient. They might notice aggressive behavior, like someone yelling or screaming, or even something as simple as like their hand makes a fist.
Mm-hmm.
If they suddenly change their mood, that could lead to escalated violence. So there's a few things there that the de-escalation training that hopefully they receive on the job can show more detailed measures to be able to not help just pick up the warning signs, but also what to do to de-escalate that specific instance before it escalates to anything physical.
And I believe this, whenever a person is at the receiving end of workplace violence, it really hampers their state of mind, their peace of mind. So can you tell me some of the psychological and emotional impact of workplace violence on victims and witnesses, and how can organizations support them?
Well, one thing I forgot to mention in the prior one, I can't believe I forgot about, because it's probably one of the top leading red flags, is anytime there's someone that comes in with an altered mindset, they have mental illness, maybe they have a substance abuse disorder, maybe they just came out of surgery. Anyone that is not they can't be rational due to the altered state, unfortunately has more likelihood of being aggressive. So that, I think that's an important one that I just want to make sure I call out. I'm sorry, yeah, you had a question. I forgot what it was.
Yes. So I was asking you, like, what are the psychological, emotional impact of workplace violence on victims and witnesses, and how can organizations support them?
Yeah, it's really, so some of the impact could be the woman that I spoke about earlier that had to get facial reconstruction surgery. She has PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder. She doesn't know if she can go back to work because when she tried, she relived that experience that had happened to her. They could have depression. They could have difficulty sleeping, anxiety, maybe lose confidence in their skill set, be more apprehensive as they're talking to other patients, even if there aren't any warning flags or red signs. So the impact can be severe, and it's not just on the person that experienced the violence, but it's the people around them, their coworkers that might have a good relationship with it, or even if they don't know them, see that and think, what about, could this have happened to me? And what would it have been like? And that can be even further heightened depending on the response of the organization. If they kind of brushed it under the rug and didn't address it to other employees or that specific person that was impacted, or they were more proactive by providing access to counseling services, employee assistance programs, support groups, being able to actually sit down and talk about what happened and how to make sure it doesn't happen again. It's so important for organizations to get ahead of these incidents and say something, because when they don't say something, people fill in the gaps in their own mindsets. It's always worse than what it actually is. So really important for folks to speak up and get help and make sure that they're offering the help.
Yes, organizations can help the ones affected by workplace violence to support them and help them cope with the situation, right? So, because after going through workplace violence, the mental stability of the person gets disturbed, and it might even lead to them quitting the jobs, right?
Exactly.
How do you think workplace violence can be reported and handled in a way that protects the well-being and safety of employees?
Well, first and foremost, the employer needs to provide a safe environment to report incidents. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes when people report, they actually get penalized, or they get some type of negative outcome from actually being brave and speaking about something that's happened. So not only does the organization need to make sure that they make it safe for people to report, but also make sure that there are no repercussions. They actually encourage the reporting. And especially in certain industries where maybe not everyone speaks the same language, make sure that it's clearly understood and documented how to report and to do so in different languages, so that people have the information that they need. It's also important within that same to report to actually state what they'll do. What's the procedure after something's been reported? What can they expect, so that they're better informed about their options.
Mm-hmm. Employers can also train and educate their employees about the same, right? So if the employers can give a heads up to the employees about recognizing, preventing, and responding to workplace violence, so I believe it will help a lot. So that brings me to the next question. How can employers effectively train and educate their employees about recognizing, preventing, and responding to workplace violence incidents?
Great question. Yeah, there's tons of training out there. I talked about de-escalation training earlier. I talked about conflict resolution. There's crisis management. The training should really cover all aspects in terms of recognizing the red flags that you asked about earlier, the warning signs, how to actually respond, how to make sure that they're keeping their safety in mind, how to report those incidents, and of course, what support services are available. What we've seen is the institutions that make sure that training is ongoing, it's interactive, have the most success, especially those that after an incident had happened, they actually have a debrief session. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, like talking about what happened, how to prevent it, having employees speak up about, how they feel about what happened to their coworker, as an example, and then actually walking away with clear actions of what to do that might be different to help prevent it for someone else. It's really interesting. We've seen some organizations that will have what they call safety moments. So anytime something has happened, maybe there is a family member of a patient that assaulted a nurse, or there was a potential for an active shooter or something. Anytime they take the time right after it's happened, when it's fresh, to sit down and talk to the employees about it, they open up that forum to have that conversation. Employees feel like the employer cares about them. They feel like they can be open about presenting their issues, and they feel more like a community because they've had that open dialogue as well.
Yes, and if employers are showing support and giving the necessary aid to the victims of workplace violence, I believe that is going to positively affect them, and they will, even if they are going through PTSD and several other mental health issues at that point of time, they will soon recover from them, right?
I would hope so. I would hope so.
Yes, so we're almost at the end of the session. So that brings me to the last question, which is, are there specific industries or occupations that are more prone to workplace violence? And what are the reasons behind this trend?
There are, so healthcare, social services, law enforcement, customer service, anyone that maybe sells alcohol, drugs, maybe has more likely to have cash, is more at risk. It's interesting, what we've seen is that right now there is an unprecedented rise of incivility. Just people are more rude than they've ever been, unfortunately, and they're taking it out on frontline workers. So any industry that has frontline workers, whether it's retail, healthcare, customer service, unfortunately are going to bear the brunt of that. Anyone that has close contact with the public, anyone that could deal with potentially emotionally charged situations, especially if, again, there's cash on premises, if the worker maybe could be alone or isolated, or if it's an environment that could be high stress. They all contribute to increased risk of violence.
Absolutely. Okay, Yasmine. So with this, we conclude today's episode. So thank you so much for your insights. So would you like to give us valuable suggestions on the topic of workplace violence?
Yeah, well, what I'd say is we believe no one should be at risk when they're trying to earn a wage. And I think we've definitely seen the shift since COVID, where employees they have more power in terms of demanding safer workplaces, and I really hope that continues. And I do think that employers need to be much more proactive than they've been, not just because they have to be now with the labor shortages, but because by taking care of their people, they take care of their business. I think one of the things that we see that's surprising is when employers don't consider the intangible impacts of workplace violence. So we mentioned, of course, the impact on the workers, but what it means for them in terms of additional costs when it comes to turnover, as an example. Whenever a nurse leaves, and a nurse is 6 times more likely to leave after she's been attacked or assaulted, turnover for that nurse is going to be around $58,000. It's going to cost them $58,000 just to find another nurse, based on the overage charges that they're going to have to pay, staffing, the time that it'll take to bring someone on board. It's more cost effective for organizations to be proactive, to take care of their staff than it is to wait until someone leaves. So things like that, I'm always surprised by when we have to talk to employees about. I think organizations that we see the most success is whenever leadership, it always starts at the top. When they prioritize safety, everyone else prioritizes safety, and really creates a really nice culture of respect, especially promoting zero violence or zero tolerance policies, encouraging open communication, listening to employees and their feedback. So I think it's something that everyone can contribute to, and it's something that's possible. And if anyone would like more information, our blog, we do a lot of content on how to deal with aggressive customers, how to combat violence, technologies that might help, de-escalation training resources. We have a lot of content there that folks might find helpful.
Yeah, so addressing workplace violence is ultimately a good thing for both the employees and employers. Am I right?
Exactly. Yeah. Unfortunately, what happens is people wait until something's happened. Don't wait until something's happened. Get ahead of it. And I do understand it's human nature. All of us, we don't think about prevention until something's happened.
Yes, exactly. So we wait until that happens, and then we realize, okay, so we had to prevent that. We had to address that issue. Yes, exactly. Right. Okay, Yasmine. So thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, the entire session was very insightful, and I hope you had a great time too.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks for listening to Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast. Please do subscribe to Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and our YouTube channel for new episodes.